Hello everybody. This video is going to discuss the plot of the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. In this video, we will address the background, also known as the equilibrium that comes before the complication. We will then address the complication, where things get complicated, where the problem emerges. Then we'll discuss rising action, which includes any and all events that increase the tension of the story. That then leads us to the climax. This is where the problem reaches a high point. This is where the tension all comes to a head. We can't possibly pack any more in. That, of course, then leads us to the falling action, which are the events which lead us to a resolution. After that point of climax, the point of tension coming to a head, events continue, sometimes gradually, sometimes less so. In this story, it's rather immediate. It leads us to the how things wrap up, which again is the resolution. We also must consider whether or not there is a reversal of fortune within the resolution. In this story, there certainly is. And what that includes, we'll get into in just a moment here. All right. To better understand the complication of the story, how that changes things, we first need to understand how things were before the complication. So this refers to the background, the opening equilibrium. In this case, we get that inference right in the first paragraph. It is very seldom that mere ordinary people like John and myself secure ancestral halls for the summer. So we're already told straight off, this is not normal. Us being in a huge estate, renting a big house is not normal. And she goes along to say at different points, basically, this is not something that we could normally afford. Just in the next paragraph below, she says, still, I would proudly declare that there is something queer about it. Else, why should it be let so cheaply? And why have stood so long untenanted? So that's a roundabout way of her saying, we would not have been able to afford this place if it wasn't so unusually cheap and if it hadn't been abandoned for so long. So they got a good deal. This is not something that they normally can afford. The reason that they are here, well, as we've discussed before, women at this time were taken into seclusion when being subjected to the rest cure. So her husband, John, who is also a doctor, at the advice of her official doctor, has rented this place to basically seclude her from the rest of society so she can begin the rest cure. So again, the complication occurs at the beginning of the story, where our protagonist and her husband move to a, quote, colonial mansion, a hereditary estate, I would say a haunted house. So that's on 171. And they moved there to deal with her, quote, temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency. And that quote is on 172. I'm jumping ahead just slightly, but on this first couple of pages, this is where we get one of our first and maybe one of our biggest pieces of foreshadowing. Something, words, actions, events that hint at what's going to come later on. So that example of foreshadowing is seen right here on the first page, on 171, where where Jane says, quote, John is a physician, and perhaps, I would not say this to a living soul, of course, but this is dead paper and a great relief to my mind. Perhaps that is the reason I do not get better. So what's going on here is she's writing in a journal. Remember, this whole story is her secret journal writing. And she's saying, I would never voice this out loud because, consequences for opinions. I would never voice this out loud, but I don't think that this treatment is going to work. I don't think that John being in charge of my treatment is going to make me better. And as we know, it turns out it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. And this, of course, reflects what was going on in real life with the rest cure. If you need to refresh your memory on the rest cure, guys, do refer back to our page titled The Basics of Gilman in our Gilman module. And while we're on the topic of foreshadowing, honestly, the title itself is another big piece of foreshadowing, if not the biggest. The Yellow Wallpaper. This is what occupies or preoccupies our narrator throughout the story, our narrator / protagonist. It's the woman in the wallpaper that she obsesses over. Yet another example of foreshadowing would be the discovery of teeth marks on the bed, or rather the bedstead. We see this early in the beginning of the story as well as at the end. In the beginning, the marks are already there. At the end, in her frustration, in her, I hesitate to use the word insanity because it can be used rather insensitively. She's not wrong for responding the way she's responding to abnormally inhumane situations. She's driven to this. It's not that something is wrong within her and that's why she bites the bedstead, but she does that again, toward the end. And there was one other piece of foreshadowing. Oh, yeah. Again in the beginning, where our narrator describes the house as creepy. He describes it as, quote, ghostly. This is one last piece of foreshadowing. The creepiness of the house foreshadows her literal creeping about the room later on. Next, after the complication, is the rising action. So the events that are included in the rising action, they start off with the beginning of her rescue. So almost immediately we're in rising action after they arrive at the house, at the estate. So the beginning of her rescue kicks off the rising action of this story, which then escalates further and further with each and every journal entry, which again, our narrator, protagonist must sneak to write. So the entry's existence itself is an escalation of tension, an escalation of something that she has to sneak, something that she has to stress and worry about. She says on 172, I did write for a while in spite of them, but it does exhaust me a good deal. Having to be sly about it, or else meet with heavy opposition. She's saying here, it's not the writing that makes her tired. It's not the writing that stresses her out. The writing makes her feel better. It's having to sneak. It's being watched like you're a prisoner, being watched by guards, which in this case is pretty much what's going on. The tension of the story is especially elevated each and every time we see the woman in the wallpaper, or rather, each and every time she sees the woman in the wallpaper. The woman in the wallpaper is also growing especially disquiet, continuously, or rather, increasingly restless. So on 177, Jane, our protagonist narrator, writes, but in the places where it isn't faded, and where the sun is just so, I can see a strange, provoking, formless sort of figure that seems to skulk about behind that silly and conspicuous front design. There's sister on the stairs. So what's going on here is she's in the room that she's, basically locked up in, or usually locked up in. She's looking around, just staring at the wallpaper because that's literally the only thing she's allowed to do. And she is staring at it. And when the sun's going down, as the sun is starting to set, she sees something. This is the first sighting of the woman in the wallpaper. And later on, as you know, it grows increasingly obvious. And the woman in the wallpaper grows increasingly disquiet. So the last piece of rising action that we have before the climax is when the narrator specifically takes note of other characters' reactions to her behavior. So Jane says, there are only 2 more days to get this paper off, talking about the wallpaper. And I believe John is beginning to notice. I don't like the look in his eyes. And I heard him ask Jenny, the servant who was helping John keep watch over Jane. And I heard him ask Jenny a lot of professional questions about me. She had a very good report to give. She said I slept a good deal in the daytime. John knows I don't sleep very well at night, for I'm so quiet. He asked me all sorts of questions too, and pretended to be very loving and kind, as if I couldn't see through him. So this is on page 185. So here we see a couple of things. We see an escalation in just her level of emotion, period. We see an escalation in the melodrama. She's very suspicious. And I would say paranoid, but like she kind of has reason to be. These people are, despite their best intentions, these people are holding her prisoner. So it's not just that she's off in her own world, it's that she is distrustful of anyone but the woman in the wallpaper. And now, finally, we reach the point of climax. Now, this is pretty much happening in the very last moments of the story, in the last pages of the story. The climax occurs on the last day of their rental. So Jane writes, "Hurrah! This is the last day, but it is enough. John is to stay in town overnight and won't be out until this evening." So when John is gone, she uses this as an opportunity to finally try to free the woman in the wallpaper. And again, herself, as the woman in the wallpaper is a representation of herself. So the climax occurs on this last day. After all of this time of waiting, she finally attacks the wallpaper, getting that last bit, attempting to free the woman within. She writes, "As soon as it was moonlight and that poor thing began to crawl and shake the pattern, I got up and ran to help her. I pulled and she shook. I shook and she pulled. And before morning we had peeled off yards of that paper." All right, so that brings us to the falling action. We are now in the end game. So the final moments of the story are what really reveal the falling action, which then takes us to the resolution. So the falling action is where the protagonist, she locks herself in the room and tosses the key out the window so that John and Jenny cannot get in. After some back and forth, John getting increasingly worried, he finally finds the key in the garden and enters the room, only to be shocked by the appearance of both the room, which his wife has, in his mind, destroyed, and his wife, who again, in his mind, is destroyed. Quote, "Then he said, very quietly indeed, 'Open the door, my darling.' 'I can't,' said I. 'The key is down by the front door under a plantain leaf.' And then I said it again several times, very gently and slowly, and said it so often that he had to go out and see. And he got it, of course, and came in. He stopped short by the door. 'What is the matter?' he cried. 'For God's sake, what are you doing?'" So this is on page 187 that this is occurring. And it takes us, very, very short falling action, that then takes us to the actual wrap-up of this story, the actual resolution. We are now at the end of the story in its final moments, the resolution, how things wrap up. So the ending of the story, how things wrap up, is that Jane, on the one hand, has, we'll say, lost her touch with reality. A less sensitive way of saying that would maybe be to say that she's, quote, lost her mind. That's a common phrase used. She's much, much worse off than she was before. So here we have one reversal in the sense that she went from a physically, mentally healthier person to a physically, mentally less healthy person. Another reversal, though, and this is more on the social side, would be that Jane, at least in her mind, is free. Before, she was bound completely by social rules and expectations, bound by her gender. She didn't even feel like she had the ability to speak up against her husband, even to share the thought that the rest cure might not make her better. If she had been able to speak up, maybe none of this would have happened. But at the time, it was such expectation that you just did whatever your husband told you. So she's now become a woman who does not do what her husband tells her. She's now become a woman who does as she pleases. even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else on the outside. I wouldn't call it a victory, but it is a reversal. It is a complete 180 change. She says on 187, "I've got out at last," said I, "in spite of you and Jane. And I've pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back." So again, guys, Jane is her name. She's talking about herself. At this point, she has already fused with the woman in the wallpaper. She's become a new woman. It's almost like a possession. It's almost like she's been taken over by this new force. So she says, "I've gotten out despite you, John, and Jane, her former self." All right, folks, that's all we have for plot for now. If you have any additional questions, make sure to read over the posted lecture materials, read over our reading recaps, and reach out if you do still have any persisting curiosities. Thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye.